All right, so evolutionary psychologists then have a very specific model for how they approach the study of human behavior. And one of the first assumptions that evolutionary psychologists make, and again, not everybody agrees with this, is that the mechanisms of the mind evolved during this period of which they call the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, the EEA. Okay? And so over millions of years, we've had persistent adaptive problems. Okay, persistent meaning the same kinds of adaptive problems, and that the mechanisms that have become our minds have been sculpted during the past, and in some cases they may not necessarily appear adaptive today. This idea of Stone Age minds and modern skulls, and we talked about this in class last time. Another assumption of the evolutionary psychology model that's very germane to this model is that evolutionary psychologists believe that there's a set of very specific domain mental models, okay, or modules rather. So the idea that there's domain-specific mental modules is a core tenet of the evolutionary psychology approach. So brains solve their adaptive problems through using this set of modules, and they're specialized for problem solving. I'll tell you a little bit more about what we mean by these domain-specific mental modules in a minute. But they use this analogy of a Swiss Army knife as a model of the mind. You would pull out the knife or the screwdriver or the saw or the scissors or whatever's in the Swiss Army knife as these different tools that you might need in order to solve a problem. Okay, and again, I'm gonna come back to this in a little bit. Another biggie is that according to the evolutionary psychology model, and again, there's a lot of controversy here, human beings have an essential universal structure, okay? Essential structure both physically and mentally. So no matter who you are, where you are, what part of the world you evolved in, what part of the world you live in now, there's very limited genetic variability amongst all humans on the planet, and so we all pretty much act the same because we've all been subjected to this EEA in the past, and that our genetic variability, whatever it is now, isn't really significant. Okay, so again, these are all assumptions of this model, and as we're going to see, there are people that disagree with these assumptions. And I'm not saying they're wrong, and I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying this is what's out there, and that as students of the evolution of human behavior, we'll sort of consider them and see what the pros and cons of thinking about this work out to be. So we're going to take each of these three ideas a little bit more specifically here. So when we're thinking about this environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, or the EEA, we want to go back to looking at our human evolution timeline, and remember that we're, at 6 million years, somewhere between 6 and 10 million years, where people started to walk upright, bipedalism evolved, freed up your hands to do stuff, as well as a number of other things that you've been thinking about and reading about. So when was the EEA? Well, according to these models, people believe that anywhere from 200 to 700,000 years in here may be that environment of evolutionary adaptation. Okay, and you can already see why it might be problematic. People might say, well, why not longer ago? Why not more recent? But in this period here of during the Pleistocene, primarily, when humans had to deal with a number of adaptive problems, okay, our brains were being constructed, and that Homo sapiens came on the scene around this time, right? So those are the brains that we have now. We see advanced tools. Homo sapiens sapiens. Notice that we have genus and species. There's Homo sapiens archaic, all right, a subspecies of more ancient humans, and Homo sapiens sapiens, which are modern humans, the species that we are today. Okay, and so the EEA is presumably within this time period, and that's again an assumption that's made by evolutionary psychologists. in continuing with looking at the evolutionary psychology model, let's go back to the idea of these specialized modules. Okay, so this specialized mentality model of the mind. Again, according to evolutionary psychologists, the mind is an organ that's been shaped by natural selection, which makes a lot of sense, but that it consists of these multiple content-rich domain-specific mental modules. And I'm going to give you some specific examples of those in a minute here. Okay, and again, they have this sort of Swiss Army knife model of how the brain functions. So there's narrow slices of environmental information that get processed by specific modules. Okay, so each adaptive problem is solved by this module versus this module versus this module. And again, these would correspond to different physical areas of the brain. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these modules now. Most of the modules, according to the EP model, the evolutionary psychology, fall under general categories that they consider domains of the mind. Okay, and that so we can take these specific modules and say they either fall under being about general purpose learning, they're about language, they're about social intelligence, they're about technical intelligence, or natural history intelligence. Okay, so each of these categories would include a number of specialized modules to solve these problems. Here now are some of the examples of these specific modules. Expression of emotion through facial expressions. Again, controlled by a certain module in the brain. A mechanism for being able to read facial expression and then determine emotion. Okay? This idea of having a predisposition to fear things without having to learn anything. There's an automatic fear of things like snakes, heights, and spiders, and even deep water. Okay, and again, the idea is that these posed a danger in the ancestral environment. Language acquisition mechanisms. And there are language acquisition mechanisms that have been identified both in human brains as well as in brains of other animals. Again, the extent to which they utilize lots of different parts of the brain and the extent to which they're coalesced into a single unit is still something that's under a lot of investigation. The idea that humans have a preference for certain kinds of mates. We're going to be eventually talking about sexual selection theory as it's applied to humans and mate preferences as part of that. And the idea that we might have modules that are specifically designed to determine our preferences for mates are part of the assumption of evolutionary psychology. The fact that there's sexual jealousy has specific mechanisms. Recognizing kin. We've talked about altruism, and that perhaps being able to recognize kin is an important thing to be able to do. Forming social contracts with others. Okay, so all of these, again, according to the evolutionary psychology model, are part of these specialized psychological mechanisms. And again, all of this is under debate. So the lists kind of go on, and even between these two slides here are not an exhaustive list of all the specific psychological mechanisms, although they do grasp a good majority of the ones that evolutionary psychologists spend their time thinking about. Modules for being able to categorize things like plants, animals, and other people. You need to be able to tell these kinds of things apart, right? And again, you can see how that relates to our ancestral environment. Being able to innately conceive of space versus time versus motion. Okay, what's here in the space that I'm occupying geographically? You know, what happened in the past versus the future versus what's happening 1,000 miles away from me, or maybe closer. Modules in order to orient or navigate through the environment as you're moving or running, right? They believe that there are modules that allow people to form certain kinds of moral beliefs. And in fact, some evolutionary psychologists believe that people that tend to have aberrant kinds of behaviors that exhibit amoral behaviors in certain circumstances, perhaps like a serial killer or somebody who's considered a sociopath, may be someone who has a genetic mutation in the module for moral belief systems. This is a hypothesis. Again, we need to test those hypotheses. I'm really trying to emphasize the caution about some of these assumptions, but it is intriguing and it is possible that there could be such a thing going on. But again, we do need a lot more evidence that would be required to actually support that or to substantiate that hypothesis. Mechanisms for detecting deception and betrayal. Again, these are the kinds of things that would have been useful and adaptive to us in our ancestral environment, knowing who you've mated with, knowing whether someone's mated with your partner, whether someone stole something from you. All of those kinds of things were things that humans needed to be able to do. And then finally, modules for processing numerical information and even processing music, tones and sounds in the environment that have led to the ability to process musical information as we experience it today. Also, the idea that there may be modules to avoid incest, the idea of just even thinking about incest or sexual relations amongst people that are too closely related can automatically bring up kind of a feeling of disgust, like, ew, that's gross, that's icky, this the automatic response. Evolutionary psychologists would say that that's because there's a module in your brain that's functioning almost like that perceptual module in a very quick, in a very fast way, so that incest is avoided very effectively. And there are good genetic reasons for avoiding incest.